right, well, good morning. How we doing? Good. It is so good to be here. We are wrapping up our summer series. In our summer, we have been in this series called Legend is the Call. This is week 9, and so if you have not had a chance to be here every week for this series, make sure you go back and check out the other messages. We've been talking about kind of these big, legendary, big picture people in the Bible. It has been an absolute blast. I have loved it. And so today we are kind of wrapping that up and getting into the fall. Crazy to think it's already August, but here we are. A couple things to remind you of as we jump into this. You should have been handed one of these on your way in. This is a list of all of our support classes and groups and kind of what they're all about. There's some new stuff in here. Make sure you check this out because we've got an incredible lineup of classes and groups in the fall that you are not going to want to miss. So check that out. Today is also the last day to turn in your backpacks for the backpack drive. So if you forgot, just go now because you don't have much time. All right, but seriously, you can run home after service or whatever and grab that if you didn't turn it back in. But today is the last day for backpack drive. All right. Well, we are closing up this series called Legends of the Call, and I want to start here. I want you to think about the hinge moments in your life. Those moments that something significant happens, a milestone happens, and maybe sometimes in the middle of those moments, you don't necessarily really understand what's happening and the significance of it in the moment, but then afterwards you kind of look back and you go, wow, that really changed things for me. And I want you to think about if there's maybe one moment or event in your life that really made a significant difference for you. For me, one of the things that happened to me, my 7th grade year was pretty rough. I had 3 teachers that just weren't really doing what they should have been doing as teachers. I had a social studies teacher, and some of you guys maybe even remember this. I talked about her a few weeks ago. She's the one who taught us that the Fertile Crescent was called Mesopotamia. So that wasn't great. And she was super kind. We all really loved her, but she just was not a good teacher. I remember she assigned this major semester project for the class and then never collected it. It just disappeared. We never knew what happened with it. I still, to this day, don't know if I got credit or if it just didn't happen. I don't know. We also I had a math teacher, and it's great to have hobbies and be like into stuff. This guy was really into trains, and let me say this: it's great to have like model trains in your basement. This guy wore a conductor outfit to teach 7th graders. Now, word of advice: your cool points are not great when you're wearing a conductor outfit to teach. The other thing he would do, the real problem was that he would teach for like 10 minutes at the beginning of class, and then he'd be like, okay, guys, do your homework. And for the rest of the class, he'd just sit at his desk. Sometimes he would fall asleep, or he'd read the paper. And so I decided one day I was just going to put this to the test, see how oblivious this guy really was, and see if I could get my desk out the door. Now, my desk was here, his desk was here, and the door was over here, and there was a girl that sat in front of me. So we both had to do this, and no joke, you guys, we almost got out the door before he even noticed that we were migrating across the room. And he was like, hey, aren't you supposed to be over there? You guys, get back in your spot. And then we had this great science teacher. He was awesome. Really funny, super energetic. He would like stand up on his desk and, kind of burnout hippie kind of guy. And he would like have this fake saxophone and all this stuff. And then like a couple years later, he got busted for having weed in his desk and got fired. No one was surprised. And so it was this sort of moment in my life where the people who were supposed to be like investing in me and doing a good job, like they just were not. They were not doing their jobs. And what ended up happening was we had never really considered any other option than just the school down the street. But we had some friends at the time that were thinking about putting their kids in a Christian school. And I went to my parents and I was like, hey, school is really rough. And I'm not learning anything, and it's just no fun. And so I ended up at this Christian school that fall, and I will never forget sitting in a chapel service, and I was a believer, and I was trying to read the Bible and pray and different stuff, but I just didn't really have any sense of what walking with God could really be. And I remember this chapel service in this basketball gym that fall where this teacher who I grew to really love ran around and just, he was spitting and yelling, and he was just all excited. And I remember him talking about the idea that there is nothing you will ever do in your life more important than following God. And I remember at the end of that service praying maybe the first really, truly authentic, heartfelt prayer of my life and just saying, God, for the rest of my life, whatever you want me to do, I'm yours. And it was one of those hinge moments in my life where I couldn't see in the moment what effect those terrible teachers were going to have on my life. But everything that I have become and everything that I have done since then hinged on that moment. And so I want you to think about a hinge moment in your life. Maybe it's something really hard, like waking up one day and realizing one of your parents is gone, or losing a child, losing a job. Maybe it's something really great, like getting married, having a child, or the day you finally got up the courage to ask her out, something like that. But what are those moments in your life that have hinged your life? Because what we're talking about today is a moment in the Old Testament where we began to turn the ship. See, Hannah's life, we're talking about a woman named Hannah today, and her life, if all we had was just her story, she only shows up in a couple of chapters in the book of 1 Samuel. We only get a little snippet of her life, and if we just had that story and we sort of just look at the miniature version of who she is, we really would not think much of her. In fact, I think if she were in the room today, she'd be like, really, you're dedicating an entire church service to my life? And so sort of on a surface level, when you just look at her life, the reality is she just did what people do. And I love the ordinariness of her life. Because when you get zoomed out a little bit, if you really understand how the Old Testament works and you begin to read the whole story, what you'll realize is that Hannah is a hinge. See, before Hannah, we're in the period of the Judges, which some of you guys love Judges because it's got some fun stories like Samson, killing a lion with his bare hands, and that's cool and fun. But understand that Judges is the single darkest period in the entire Old Testament. It is an absolute mess. There is no leadership. Everyone is confused. It's a nightmare. And then after Hannah's life, we're on this path where Samuel is leading. He's the prophet. People are starting to listen to God again, and we're going to end up with David, which is probably the high point of the Old Testament. And the hinge of all of this is an ordinary woman praying in a tent. And I don't know about you, but that encourages me so much. Because the reality is the world feels really big. The world feels really crazy and sometimes a little scary. But if we take the Bible seriously, we will see that it is ordinary people doing ordinary things who just go to God and say, hey, I still think that you can do something with one person's life. Those are the people who change everything. And so in this series, as we've talked about these big, larger-than-life heroes, I want you to recognize that none of them started that way. If we understand their lives, when we met them, they were just trying to live their normal, ordinary lives. But at some point or another, they said to God, hey, whatever you want to do with my life, I'm going to say yes. So I want you to take a look at this. Our legend of the call for week 9 is Hannah. Now, her occupation is sort of hard to define because she kind of did what every woman did at this point in history, but it would be weird to say her occupation was just woman. And so we're going to go with farm wife, okay? Because she was a woman who was kind of in charge of a household, and she probably, like most women at this point, worked sun up to sundown, walking maybe a couple of miles to the well to get water for the day for her family, and cooking and making clothing and working incredibly hard. Okay, she didn't officially have a job, but she was keeping people alive. But her place in life when we meet her is that she's in the midst of a long battle with infertility and loneliness. And this, at this point in history, is a huge deal, and it's a huge source of shame for her that she had gotten married and could not have children. And so much of a woman's identity at this point in history was wrapped up in her ability to have children. Some people even thought that that meant she had done something wrong. She had sinned. She was cursed by God because she couldn't have children. But her calling was to stand as a beacon of prayer in a time of chaos. To stand as a beacon of prayer in a time of chaos. Now, I don't know if you know anything about times of chaos, if you've ever lived through a time where things feel chaotic and rough in the world, sort of in general, but that's the kind of world that Hannah lived in. And so I want to talk a little bit about the world she came from. I want you to write these things down. This is what was going on around Hannah. See if you connect with any of this. First of all, Hannah's world was filled with immature and irresponsible leaders. Hannah's world was filled with immature and irresponsible leaders, kind of like my middle school. We had some teachers who were not really mature and responsible and helping us out, right? And so what you need to know about the world at this time, when Hannah was alive, we didn't have kings yet in Israel, and so the sort of leaders of everything were the priests, the spiritual leaders. These were men who were supposed to lead people to help them understand who God was and how to follow him. And the high priest at this point is a man named Eli. Now, Eli is getting old, and his two sons are getting sort of in training to be raised up to take over as the spiritual leaders. So if you can sort of picture this scenario, Eli is supposed to be training his sons to know the Lord and to lead the entire nation, spiritually speaking. But this is the comment in 1 Samuel about them. It says, the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. Now, when your spiritual leaders don't even know the Lord, we have a problem, don't we? We have this immature and irresponsible leadership. In fact, these guys were stealing from people trying to get to God. They were manipulating their position as spiritual leaders to make themselves rich. That's what was going on. So ask yourself this: when have I been disappointed with someone who was supposed to lead me? When in my life have I been disappointed with someone who was supposed to lead me? Maybe you've had a boss or a teacher or a coach or even a church leader at some point in your life, and you're like, man, they were supposed to be the person I would count on. They were supposed to be the person that I was going to be able to lean on, and you found out the hard way that you couldn't trust that person. I want you to jot something down. Maybe it's a name or a memory that you just go, yeah, this was such a disappointing moment in my life because I was supposed to be able to trust my parents. I was supposed to be able to trust my pastors. I was supposed to be able to trust my teachers. I was supposed to be able to trust my coaches, and they let me down. I had a strange experience a couple of years ago. I don't know if the name Ravi Zacharias means anything to you, but Ravi passed away a few years ago. He was this brilliant Christian speaker, one of the most sought after and famous Christian speakers in the entire world. I mean, this is a guy who would, he was a philosopher, and he would talk about why believing in God still makes sense. And he would have debates at places like Harvard and Yale and Stanford, and he just was everywhere in the world. He grew up in India, so he had this really unique perspective, one of the most brilliant men on the planet. And from everything I heard from some people who had met him and spent time with him, also seemed like he was just very kind and respectful and an honorable man. And so when he passed away, it was this moment for me of like, man, one of my heroes has died. And so there's all the grief that's wrapped up in that, and just going, man, I just wish we still had his voice. I feel like we still need him. But then over the next couple of weeks, it started coming out that from everything we can tell, he spent a lot of time a lot of different places in the world taking advantage of that position and taking advantage of the trust and taking advantage of a lot of women in a lot of places and using his reputation to convince them to cover up what he had done to them. I remember that moment too, just going, man, I'm just so disappointed. And I've been around long enough to know that anybody can be talented. And just because they're good at what they do on a stage, it doesn't mean they have character to back it up. And so it didn't cause me to question my faith or change what I thought about the truth of the things that Ravi had said. But it's heartbreaking to think about those women and those families who trusted a man they should have been able to trust and then were abused and taken advantage of. See, that was Hannah's world. And we're going to see some specific examples of the failures of leadership that surrounded her. But I want to tell you, too, that Hannah's world was filled with personal loneliness. Hannah lived an incredibly lonely life. In fact, there was something that happened relatively regularly back then. If you got married and your wife was not producing any children, it was not uncommon for a man to take on another wife because it was really important for him to have children to be able to sort of manage life and pass on his legacy. It wasn't a great idea, and I'm sure you can imagine what kind of families this produced. But it was not uncommon, and so this is what happens from everything we can tell in Hannah's life. It seems like she was probably the one that her husband Elkanah married first, and at first they were in love and they were young and everything was going to be great, and then year after year passed and she was not getting pregnant. And pretty soon he just said, you know what, we're going to find a different way to do this. And now when we meet her, Hannah's in a situation where this other wife that he has found has had children, and so he's sort of said to her, maybe not in so many words, but at least by his actions, hey, here's my family, and don't worry, I'm not going to cast you out. You're not going to starve. I'll keep feeding you, but you're sort of the extra here. See, in 1 Samuel 2, this is almost the very beginning of the book. It says Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. And so we're going to get the context of the situation where a lot of the action in this story is going to happen. It says each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh, that's where the tabernacle was, to worship and sacrifice the Lord at the tabernacle. On the days Elkanah presented his sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to Peninnah and each of her children. And though he loved Hannah, he would give her only one choice portion because the Lord had given her no children. So Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. Year after year, it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle, and each time Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. See, this is a time of the year that's supposed to be this big celebration. It was the Passover. It was the biggest feast of the year. And what a lot of people don't understand about these sacrifices that the Old Testament talks about is that you would actually get the majority of the meat back. So when you would take your lamb or your bull or whatever and you would give it over to the priest at the tabernacle, they would butcher it and then they would use part of it for a sacrifice, but most of it would be given back to you. And so at these feasts was the best meal you had all year long, and it was this huge celebration. Because when you were generous to God, He was even more than generous back to you. And so Hannah would be with this family. And they lived about 14 miles from Shiloh. And so, you remember, this is a time before the, Model T. And so we have a family that is walking dusty roads, probably with a couple of donkeys and a couple of animals, and then Peninnah and her children, and Hannah sort of lagging behind doing her own thing. And for 14 miles, she would walk with this family and with her husband and with the other wife and all of her children. And then they would get to the tabernacle, and it would be this time that was supposed to be this huge celebration, and you can imagine what it felt like for her to be the last and the least. And to have her husband give her one little piece of meat and say, here you go, you're not going to starve, don't worry. We'll take care of you. To watch everyone else celebrate and feel like the extra. Maybe you've been in this situation. I mean, the loneliest times of all are the times you're actually surrounded by people. So ask yourself this, and maybe you jot something down. Where in my life do I feel alone? Where in my life do I feel alone? Because Hannah's life, it was a life of loneliness, surrounded by celebration year after year after year, but not participating in any of it. And then third, we see that Hannah's world was filled with silence from God. Hannah's world was filled with silence from God. Remember that prior to Hannah's life, we're in this period of the Judges where for about 400 years, nobody's really paying attention, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and nobody really cares what God has to say, and nobody is really trying to hear from the Lord because they just want to live their own life their own way. And by the time we get to 1 Samuel 3, we have this sort of summary statement that says, now in those days, messages from the Lord were very rare and visions were quite uncommon. It was not that God was unwilling to speak, it was just that no one cared to listen. So I want you to ask yourself, where in my life do I wish God would speak? Where am I feeling that deafening silence that I just wish I had some wisdom from God? Maybe you look at God and you go, God, I just wish that you had some wisdom for me with my kids. God, I just wish you would help me at work to figure out how to get out of this situation that I'm in. God, I just wish you would give me some little bit of leverage in my finances, that you would help me to know how to get my budget under control. God, I just wish that you would help me understand how I could do better with my spouse or how I could get through to them. God, I just wish that you would give me some way, some information. Would you just say something? That's where Hannah starts. She starts in a world where the sky feels dark and silent and God does not care. He's forgotten. And then finally, Hannah's world was filled with spiritual confusion. It's filled with spiritual confusion. I told you the leaders really were not doing what they were supposed to do. And if we continue to follow this story, what we see is we see Hannah year after year after year going to the tabernacle with her family for Passover and being the extra, being the other one, being so discouraged and depressed that she's not even eating. And if you picture this situation, this is a huge festival, and so there are hundreds, maybe thousands of families that are spread out all over the place, and it's this massive tent and this massive grounds where there are people who are giving their sacrifices, and then they're having these festive meals, and everyone's happy and everyone's excited, and it's the best time of year because we're remembering that at once we were slaves and now we're free and we get to follow the Lord. And Hannah is there watching her family celebrate, feeling like such an outsider, and finally one year it gets to be too much. And so you can picture this massive tent with all of these meals going on, and probably without anyone even noticing, at one point Hannah just slips away. And she goes to the corner of a tent and just begins to pray. And this is where we pick up the story. It says, Hannah prayed silently to the Lord for a long time, but her lips were moving. And Eli, the priest that we talked about, this is how we know how terrible this guy was at his job. Eli, the priest, thought she was drunk. He says, how long are you going to stay drunk? Sober up. And she's like interrupted out of her desperate prayer, wiping tears from her eyes and goes, What? What are you talking about? She says, Sir, please don't think I'm no good. I'm not drunk. I haven't been drinking. Please, I feel miserable and terribly upset. I've been praying all this time, telling the Lord about my problems. Now, when your pastors can't recognize a woman desperately praying, but instead judge her and assume that she's drunk, we have an issue with leadership. And even after this, if you continue reading the story, she corrects him and says, No, I've been praying desperately to the Lord. And you'd think he'd be like, wow, finally someone. But instead he's like, oh, good luck with that. Kind of like high fives her and walks away. So it's this time where even the spiritual leaders around her are so confused about what God's doing. And so I want to ask you to consider this question. Where in my life am I confused about what God is doing? Where in your life does it feel foggy and muddy, where you look at your circumstances and you go, God, I don't understand. I don't feel like I could see it. I just wish I could have some clarity about what you want, about what's next, about what step to take. I just don't know. What is that situation where you feel that tension? Well, as we watch Hannah and her response in this, what I see is clarity. And so we can see 3 lessons from her that I really want you to wrestle with today. And the first one is this. I want you to write this down. I gain clarity in times of chaos when I ask God to show me what He wants most for my life. This is where it starts. When I ask God to show me what He wants most for my life. It's interesting how these times of chaos make us so afraid, don't they? I mean, I feel like everywhere we look right now, we see all the reasons why we're supposed to be scared. And fear, what it does is it makes us really selfish. It makes us self-protect. And it's so bizarre that we have been told for years now that we are a threat to each other because we're humans that breathe. Isn't that strange? It's a strange message. And I had a very weird experience a couple of weeks ago. I was at a store and, normally it's just sort of second nature. You see that someone's behind you and you hold the door, let them go through, and it's not a big deal. And you walk on and move on with your life. But this message that has been infused in us that getting close to each other means you're trying to murder someone is it's a little intense. And so I was at this store and I see that this woman is behind me and I go to open the door and I'm about to step back to hold it for her and I realize she might actually be thinking that I'm trying to kill her. I don't know what she thinks about all this, and in order to get in the door, she's going to have to go pretty close to me, and I froze. It was such a weird thing. But fear has made it impossible to be kind to each other. And that's the kind of world Hannah lived in. A world completely paralyzed and selfish. And yet we have this woman who's willing to go to God and say, hey, I don't know what you want to do with me. I don't know what you could do with one life. But whatever I've got that you can use, you can have it. And so here's what happens. This is the prayer that Hannah was praying when she got interrupted by that lovely priest. It says, Hannah made this vow, O Lord of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime, and as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. And sometimes we read this and we're like, she's making this bargain with God. She's trying to twist God's arm, and we think it's this selfish prayer. It's not a selfish prayer at all. She's giving this child back to God. She's not asking for anything for herself. In fact, I don't know if you know this. I don't know this from my own personal experience, but I hear pregnancy is hard. And especially back then, a lot of women died giving birth. But she goes to God and she says, God, if you can do something, even if it wrecks my body, I'm willing. And I don't think that she saw the whole big picture of everything we've been talking about, of this massive move from the judges into the time of David. I think she was just one person who was standing there saying, hey, all I've got is my life to offer you, but if you can do something with it, go ahead. I think that's what this prayer is. And there's this really cool passage that Jesus gives us. It's a really vivid picture in Matthew 7 when he's talking about prayer and he's talking about the heart of God for us. He says, you parents, if your children ask for a loaf of bread, do you give them a stone instead? I mean, can you imagine that? Like toddler walking up to mom, can I have a PB&J? Nope, but here's a rock. And the next one's even better. It says, if they ask for a fish, do you give them a snake? Mommy, I need mac and cheese. Nope, but here's a rattlesnake. Ha ha, we're going to the hospital today. This will be fun. That's not what parents do, right? No. It says, of course not. So if you sinful people know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give good gifts to those who ask him? See, God really is a good dad. He knows what's best for you. But here's the problem. There's a flip side to this verse. See, a lot of us are mad at God because we're begging him for snakes and rocks, and he's saying no. We are desperately begging God to give us things that are going to destroy us. And I have to tell you guys that God will never help you sin. And God is really good, far better than you and I are, at knowing what's going to be good for you and what's going to destroy you. And yeah, there is a time eventually where God goes, okay, fine, have it your way, and he gets out of your way, but he's never going to help you sin. And sometimes the very best thing God can say to you is no. No, that's not good for you. And so what is our posture in prayer? How do we begin in prayer? We begin like Hannah began and we say, God, what do you want? Because we love the Santa Claus style prayer, don't we? Wake up in the morning, your feet hit the ground. Okay, God, here's my list. By the end of the day, I need a good cup of coffee, a Maserati, and a bigger house. Right? And we move on with our day and we get mad thinking God's not listening. Well, I have a challenge for you. I want you to pray like Hannah. For the next 30 days, my challenge for you is that you would start your prayer this way. God, what do you want for me today? My wife, she's such a challenge and an inspiration to me in this. You know, she wakes up every single morning, she goes down to the couch, she has her Bible, she has her journal, and she's praying. And every day that I'm not having to leave early for work, I'm there with her. But my journal is filled with all of the things that I need to talk to God about. And hers is filled with day after day after day of, God, what do you want me to know? What do you need me to know about my kids, about my job, about my work today? And so I just want to challenge you between now and Labor Day, every single day, every single time you pray, start this way. God, what do you want for me today? Because it has to start there. Then secondly, I gain clarity in times of chaos when I give back to God whatever he gives me. When I give back to God whatever he gives me. So here's what happens. I'm sure you can imagine how this story goes. She goes home after this particular Passover and she gets pregnant. God grants this prayer, and so she has the baby, and she tells Elkanah each year at Passover, I've got to at least get him to the point that he can survive on his own before I give him to the Lord. And so for 4 or 5 years, she has this precious time with her son. And she doesn't go to the tabernacle with him, but the time comes when she knows it's time. And guys, listen, if there is ever an example in the Bible of a person who trusts God, regardless of what kind of leadership she's under, this is it. Because think about where she's going and who she's giving her son to. The verse we're about to read is a conversation between her and Eli, that priest, who probably doesn't even remember her, who thought she was drunk when she was praying. That's the guy who's going to raise her son. But she brings him back, and she goes to Eli, and she says this. She says, I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him, not to you, Eli, now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. So God gives her this incredible gift of a child, and she says, okay, God, he's yours. So I want you to ask yourself this: what is the last thing God gave me? What is the last thing God gave me, and how will I give it back to him? It's funny, we had a couple here last night. Their baby is 10 days old. This is their first time back at church. And they caught me afterwards. They were like, I said, no, that's not. Please go pick up your children downstairs after church, okay? This was a one-time arrangement, and this is not the outcome we're looking for out of today. But ask yourself this, and maybe it is your kids. I mean, if you're a parent, realistically, this is probably the place you need to start with this, is to say to God, they're yours. I'm going to do my very best to raise them and influence them well, but like Samuel, they're yours. You're in charge of their life. And I'm not going to try so hard to protect them from every bad experience that they never learn the things that they need to learn. But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a job that God has given you, and you need to spend some time going, God, what would it look like to go to work and spend that 8 or 10 hours every day honoring you and offering that to you? What would it look like to take the commute that you've given me, the 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 or 45 minutes or whatever it is, however long it takes you every day, what would it look like, instead of seeing that as my time, to say, God, this is yours? And to begin praying during that time to whoever or for whoever God brings to your mind, and to begin actually stopping when you see those people with signs and treating them like they're human beings, and maybe even planning ahead and having something valuable and worthwhile to give them. What would it look like for you to take your marriage or your home or your friendships or your money and to say, God, this is yours. I'm giving it back to you. Maybe that's a formal ceremony. We do a milestone journey with kids where you can talk to our pastors. You can talk to Jacob about what it looks like to actually formally dedicate your children to the Lord. We'd love to help you with that. And it's about a whole lot more than just a little prayer that says, okay, this kid is God's. It's the way you live your life every single day. Maybe it looks like taking some of your money and investing it here in what we're doing in this building project, because it's going to go to our community. I don't know what it is for you, but I will tell you this, and this is not this prosperity garbage that is so much out there right now, but Rick is right. You can't outgive God. And if you keep reading the story, one of the things that we find out, remember, Hannah prayed for one child. Hannah said, if you give me a son, I will give him back to you. And when that happened, she was done. She was like, okay. But Hannah had 5 more children. See, God's way more generous than we are. And when we give back to him what he gives to us, he just keeps giving. That's where we get clarity, when we live a life of generosity. And then third, finally, I gain clarity in times of chaos when I start changing the world by changing my home. When I start changing the world by changing my home. You know, like Hannah's world, our world feels like one where there's a lot of big problems. And it's pretty easy to sit here and say, what could a person like me do? But I want you to remember what I told you at the beginning about the Old Testament, because Hannah may not have been able to see this. She was just living her life. She was trying to be faithful. She was doing the best that she could in her situation. But what God saw was that the page was turning from darkness to light. What God saw was that the faithfulness of one woman praying in a tent would be the catalyst that would get them out of the muck and the mire of the judges and out of the confusion, and would begin to lead them to the point where not too long after this, that little boy would grow up, and he would take oil and he would find a little shepherd boy out in the fields, and he would pour it over his head, and that shepherd boy would kill a giant and become the greatest king that Israel ever had, and there would be hope again. But all of it started with that prayer in that tent with that ordinary mom who, if she were here, she would go, "Really? You're spending a whole weekend talking about me? I just don't get it." And I love the ordinariness of this story. See, here's what happens. 1 Samuel 2, it says, "But Samuel, though he was only a boy, served the Lord. He wore a linen garment like that of a priest. And each year his mother made a small coat for him and brought it to him when she came with her husband for the sacrifice." And this precious mom, year after year after year, went back to see her son that same holiday, that same Passover, that same celebration. And one year she brought a baby with her to meet his big brother. And the next year another, and then another, and another, and pretty soon there were 5. And she would tell them the stories of their big brother and how he was at the tabernacle serving the Lord, and they would go visit him year after year. And each year she would bring with her this little coat. Because remember, this is a world where most people had one set of clothing. So each year she'd bring him his clothes for the year. But you know what I think she was probably doing that whole year as she weaved that coat? She's still praying for that boy. And she showed up every year at Passover. And I think she handed him that little coat and she said, "Samuel, I'm so proud of you, and I'm still praying for you." And guys, listen, the longer I live and the longer I do this, the more convinced I am that everything starts at home. There is no such thing as an ordinary day. And there is no such thing as an ordinary person. So you got to ask yourself, what one thing could I do to dedicate my home to God? What's one thing I could do? For her, it was sitting there year after year, day after day, making clothes for her son and praying for him. And it changed the world. And maybe you're thinking, oh, this home stuff. I mean, you're talking about moms and dads with kids. Well, yeah, we are. And for you, if you are a mom or a dad with kids, you need to think about what it looks like to build a home where God is honored, where you say, hey, this is a place where we take God seriously. This is a place where we pray together. This is a place where we have grace and we forgive each other. This is a place where we believe that God's way still works. That's crucial for you. But every single one of us, regardless of your situation in life, we have times, we have a home, we have a place, we have opportunities where we are alone and by ourselves, where we're going to decide who we're going to be. And it doesn't matter if you're 10 or 11 or 12 living in your parents' house, or you're retired and an empty nester, or you're in college, or you're single and you have roommates, or you're single and you live by yourself. It doesn't matter. What matters most about you is what you do when you are alone. So what is one thing you could begin to change that would shift something in your home and get you to a place where you can honestly say, this part of my life belongs to God? I love this hint back to Samuel. It's interesting. Samuel was such a crucial part of what happened at this time in Israelite history. And in some ways, he's one of the most famous people in the entire Old Testament. But outside of 1st and 2nd Samuel that are named after him, and really Samuel's life, he grows up in the tabernacle, and then he's the one who makes Saul king, and then he kind of cleans up Saul's mistakes. But once he has made David king, he sort of fades out. His job's done. And from that point on, we don't hear about him a lot. He's not like Moses and David and Abraham, where all over the Old Testament they're talking about him over and over and over again. But there are a couple of references to him. And this one, I doubt that you read 2 Chronicles 35 all that recently, but tucked away in 2 Chronicles 35, there's this reference to Samuel that I find so fascinating and beautiful. See, in 2 Chronicles 35, we're about 400 years later. And the king is a young man named Josiah. Josiah became king at 8 years old, and it was a similar kind of time where the men who had come before him as kings were just completely confused, and they were just not doing their jobs very well at all, and nobody really cared about what God had to say. In fact, it was so bad that they had lost the Bible. And so Josiah, at 8 years old, did not even know that 500 or 600 yards from his palace was a copy of the Bible and a temple and all that he needed to know how to rule his kingdom well and bring the people back to God. And so it took him years to find this and figure this out. But when he did, he began to read the Bible again and began to realize how far they had gotten from what God wanted. And one of the things that he reinstituted was the Passover. This yearly celebration where everyone got together and remembered with this massive celebratory meal that we used to be slaves, but now we are free to follow God, and that's who we will always be because God has rescued us. And there's this little verse tucked away in 2 Chronicles 35 that says this. It says, "No Passover like it." Like this Passover that Josiah instituted. No Passover like it had been kept in Israel since the days of Samuel the prophet. So I've got to ask, what are you going to be famous for in 400 years? The thing they remembered about Samuel was that when Samuel was in charge, Passover was a big deal. I love that. Because Passover was the time of the year where Samuel got to see his mom. He got to get that little coat. And he got to be reminded that it is ordinary people following God that change everything. And he never let anyone else forget that prayer makes a difference. You know, my sister, she's just this incredible person. She's one of my favorite people. And when she was in college, she was in leadership at a Christian community at her public university. And at some point or another, I don't even know really the whole story, but somebody came up to her and they were just like, "Hey, what's the deal with you? Like, help me understand. How are you who you are? Like, you're just such an incredible person. I want to know what happened to make you you." My sister just smiled and said, "Oh, my mom prayed for me." That was her whole resume. You know, I think that someday, if I get to meet Samuel, which I hope I do, if I could ask him that, if he were here today and we could say, "Hey, what was it that made you the kind of person who could be born into a time of complete and total meltdown and chaos where there was no leadership you could trust, no one was following the Lord, and by the end of your life, we are in the best times that Israel ever had. What happened because you were the guy who picked the country up and carried it on your back and said, we are going to follow God?" How does that happen? I think you just smile and say, "Oh, my mom prayed for me." See, all of us have an opportunity to bring someone a little coat to go to God and to say, God, whatever you want to do with me, where I'm at right now, no matter my age, no matter my situation in life, no matter how much power or money or influence or skill I feel like I have, I actually am audacious enough to think that you can do something with me. That's all Hannah ever did. So as we wrap up this series, I want to challenge you. We're going to sing a song in just a minute. It's a song called Make Room, and it says to God, God, I want to make room for you in my life to do whatever you want to do. Taking my hands off the steering wheel, and I'm asking that you would use whatever you can of me, whatever it costs me for the rest of my life, however much more time I have. Whatever you give me, I will give back to you. And between now and that song, I want to challenge you to think, are you ready to say what Hannah said? To say, you can have me, and I'll follow you the best I can. So as we think about that, as we process that, would you do me a favor? Would you bow your heads and close your eyes for just a minute? Because some of you aren't even ready for that question yet, because you don't know for sure that you know the Lord, like Eli's sons. Maybe you don't. Maybe you have questions. Maybe you don't know what it means to follow the Lord. And maybe you came in here today, or you started watching, and you don't have that question answered of, if I were to die today, do I know for sure that I would be in heaven with God? Well, you can know that right now. It's actually very simple. The Bible explains it so simply. God loves you, every single one of you, exactly as you are. But He also knows, like you and I know, that we've made mistakes, we've done things wrong, and the Bible calls that sin. But the good news is that although sin demands a price, God, because He loves us, sent His Son Jesus to die in our place and to pay the price for sin so that our slate could be wiped clean and we could have the promise that every single thing we've ever done, everything we're doing now, and everything we ever will do that dishonors God and ourselves and other people, all of it can be wiped away. And because of the death of Jesus on the cross, we can come to God in faith and just say, yes, I believe and I receive the free gift of salvation. So if that makes sense to you and you want that and you've never done that, right now you can pray silently in your mind something like this. God, I know I'm a sinner. I've done things wrong. I've made mistakes, but I believe that Jesus died for me. And I receive that free gift of salvation. If that was you and that made sense to you, I'm not going to embarrass you in any way. I would just love to know who you are so that I can pray for you. And so in a minute, I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand. So if you're here in the room with us and that made sense to you, and today you're placing your faith in Christ and receiving that gift of salvation with heads bowed and eyes closed, would you just lift up your hand for just a minute and put it right back down? Just slip it up. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And if you're watching online and you want to get in touch with us, we would love to know that you've made that decision. You can send us a text. The number here at the church is 720-895-9000. You can send us the word believe and let us know. We'll get in touch with you. We have a gift for you. We would love to help you get started. And for all of us, as we process through these stories and these lives of people like Hannah and David and Nehemiah, recognize that they were just like you and me. They were ordinary people giving their lives over to an extraordinary God. And when they took the time and showed the courage to make room for Him, everything changed. Sometimes the fear is that we can't actually trust Him. But I want you to know, if you hear nothing else, that He is good and that He only wants good things for you. So Jesus, we do ask that you would show us whatever we need to be able to trust you, like Hannah did. Really, all she did was what made sense, because you are the best possible person to raise that little boy that she loved so much. And she trusted you because you're trustworthy. And so as we try in our way, the best that we can, with as much courage as we can muster, to say, God, I'm making room for you, we ask that you would help us, that you would increase our faith. And we're grateful that you have been trustworthy with all that we have ever put in your hands.